Powerful yet fair, Shanks is without a doubt one of the strongest leaders in the OP09 format. He's also one of the more simpler leaders, which is great for new and experienced players alike. This is my guide on how to play OP09 Shanks. So the structure of this video: first we're going to take a brief look at the leader and the general game plan of Shanks, then we're going to look at the core cards in the deck, a small note on the rush versus control debate, going to go over every card candidate that is common or even uncommon in Shanks lists today, general strategies and the curve of Shanks both going first and going second, and then we're going to take a brief look at some of the top matchups and how your game plan might differ into those from a standard game plan. So here's your leader. It is Shanks. He gives you a free 1k every turn, which is really nice. A defensive red leader is not the most common, and I think this really lends itself to the more controlling playstyle. If you want to play Rush, I think you're better off playing a deck like Bello Betty or a deck like Zoro. They're much better at swarming the board, getting that early aggression. There is something to be said for the Shanks Rush build, and we'll cover that shortly. I do think the control build of Shanks is by far the best, and it has seen the best results both in Japan and so far in the West. So Shanks' effect, when your opponent attacks, you can just give something minus 1000. So this is a really versatile effect. We've not really seen an effect like this on a red leader before, and defensive red is a really cool archetype. He almost plays a little bit like a red version of Lucci, clearing the board with your characters whilst removing your opponents. So this is the backbone of the list. Whether you're playing the Rush or the control build of Shanks, I think this is basically non-negotiable. We're going to cover all of these cards later, but if you wanted to make your own build, I think this is a really good place to start from if you want just the absolute bare bones of what's going to go in your Shanks deck. So the Rush version, you have a much stronger early game. You're playing cards like the 3-cost Zoro and the 5-cost Luffy to get a lot of aggression into your opponent's face, make them have difficulties dealing with your early aggression, whilst using your leader effect to defend those characters, because your opponent's going to want to develop their own characters still. So if they're just swinging 5s or 6s into your tapped Rush units, you can use your leader effect to defend them very efficiently. One of the typical problems that Rush and aggro decks face is running out of cards, and aggro decks have different ways of getting around that. Doflamingo just doesn't lose card advantage because it plays from the top of the deck rather than the hand a lot of the time. Bello Betty simply doesn't care and tries to win before that lack of hand advantage actually matters. But Shanks can use his leader effect to effectively buy himself 1 or 2 cards here and there to make it easier to defend his Rush units while still getting the value out of their early aggression. So the Rush version is admittedly much better into Nami and Teach. Nami is a pretty horrendous matchup for the control build, similar to how it's a really bad matchup for decks like Enel. We're really late game focused, so Nami just gets crazy value in the early game. They can use so many cards like Kaya and Pilaf, just get through their deck before we start attacking, and that whilst our swings when we do start attacking are going to be enormous, it's not going to be enough. It's just not going to be enough. Too little, too late. Teach also, Rush is just very good into Teach in general. I think the control build of Shanks is also very reasonable into Teach. It's not a crazy bad matchup like Nami, but if your locals is full of Teach, the Rush version of Shanks is even better. It's also less common, so people are going to have less practice against the Rush build. Everyone's going to know how to deal with a Beckman on 7, but the Zoro on 3 might throw people off guard, mess with their heads a little, and sometimes cause them to make mistakes. You can also be stronger into Lucci or Enel depending on the build, but both these decks typically aren't huge fans of Rush. Enel can deal with it especially if they get the right triggers, but Lucci especially is not a huge fan of just massive amounts of Rush, especially when you can back it up in that late game with bigger bodies that are harder for them to remove, especially if they've expended some of their events to remove your smaller Rush units like Zoro or Luffy. Hidden Killer is also really nice into both of these decks to drop at the end of the game to surprise them, catch them off guard, and put in a nice big 7k Rush attack for very low cost. However, we do have a much weaker late game with the Rush version, because our opponent is likely going to be able to develop their board, and we're going to have a greater difficulty dealing with their board. Our late game units are going to get swarmed out. Playing a 10 cost Shanks is still amazing, but if your opponent's got 3 or 4 dudes that are then going to attack into your life, it can create issues. It's much less safe to drop the Shanks when we're not controlling their board as much. You're also weaker into Doflamingo and Pluffy. They're just kind of doing what we would be doing with a Rush build, but better. Obviously, they don't have Rush specifically, but Doflamingo having such crazy hand advantage, whilst having big swings in the early game into our Rush units, is not great. And Purple Luffy's units are just really hard to deal with, especially if you're using cards for Rushers, and not for things like Building Snake or Rayleigh. Also weak into Bonney, I find, for what it's worth. I think some of the control cards are just exceptional in the Bonney matchup, especially 8 cost Rayleigh. So not having as many or as great access to those can be limiting. And no searchers can make it less consistent, but we do choose to play quite a lot of redundancy, especially in the Rush units. So you're going to see some amount of Rush every game. So if you wanted to try out the Rush build, this is a rough build that I've put together that I could recommend. You can see some of the interesting cards I've included. I've included one of the Nico Robin to deal with Rebecca. Rebecca spam in black is like the bane of every Rush deck's existence, because it's really hard to just deal with them. Yes, you can play Lime Juice to turn it off, but that costs 3 Don, it's quite expensive. Robin just costing 1 is significantly better. I do think you'd want at least 2 Roger in a Rush build, because we're going to put a lot of pressure on their life. Chance of us getting them to 0 and then blockering up is reasonable. So a couple of Roger just to lock up games seems good. 4 of the Rush Zorro is very important in a build like this. Seeing this on 3 is probably the thing you should be mulliganing for in most matchups. We also have 2 of the Rush Luffy for a little bit of unblockable, and 3 of the Kid and Killer. This card catches people off guard. This is also one you could consider just in your regular Shanks build. I think the Kid and Killer is a little bit underutilized right now. It just catches people off guard, and it is so efficient. 4 for 7 is crazy. Other than that, this is not that dissimilar from a Control Shanks build. We still have a couple of the Rayleigh, we've still got the Ben, we've still got the 3 of the Rush Shanks. I'm still playing a couple Lucky Roo. I think it's important to still have some blockers, and the Roo does offer some good utility over the Rayleigh in certain situations, especially against Purple Luffy. So the Control version, you have a much stronger late game. Your late game is just so much stronger. We have all these big units that remove dudes, and it's just great. It's just great. Lots of 50-50 matchups across the field. If you like playing a deck that doesn't have too many horrendous matchups, but also doesn't have many free matchups, this is a decent one to play. I think not having anything really where your opponent flips over their leader and you're like, yes, I'm going to win this game, is a little bit of a shame, compared to something like a Lucci deck, where your opponent flips over some leaders and you just know you're going to win, and then they flip over a BY Luffy and there's a good chance you're going to lose. It's a very different mentality going into a tournament. If you are not confident predicting a meta, I think Shanks is a very fair pick. None of your matchups, especially into the top decks, are horrendous. So you're never going to be too disappointed unless you run into a bunch of Namis, I guess. There's a lot of different tech options. Your opponent will be familiar with Shanks. Everyone knows how to play against Shanks at this point, but they're not going to be able to predict exactly which techs you're playing in your list. And I think that's one of the biggest strengths of Shanks. Your opponent is going to try and play around as much as they can, but if you've got just some crazy cards that your opponent's not expecting, you can catch them off guard and eke wins out, where you might struggle with another deck, potentially like a Lucci, where they know exactly what you're going to do. You can have techs in your Lucci deck, but they're not generally that crazy. They generally all just say, remove thing. So whereas with Shanks, you have some different techs that do different things. You could be playing Rush units, you could be playing more power reduction cards. Your opponent's just not going to know until you drop it on them. You've also got a lot of space to tailor your list to a local meta. So if you're not thinking regionals, if you're thinking just about your locals, and your locals is full of Doflamingo players, you can tailor your list to beat Doflamingo more reliably. If your locals just has a bunch of purple Luffy players, you can tailor your list for that. If your locals has a bunch of Nami players, switch decks, play Bello Betty. But yeah, so long as your locals isn't full of a bunch of crazy Nami players, you've got a pretty reasonable chance to be able to tailor your list to fit that meta. We do have a much weaker early game, however. Your 3 and 4 Don turns in particular are pretty weak. Lucky Roo is typically the only meaningful character that we're dropping on those first couple turns, and into a lot of matchups like Doflamingo, dropping him is not great because they will just bounce it with lore. So I would say overall you have a very strong late game but a weaker early game compared to the Rush version. But your early game is not the worst, right? Even just swinging 9 on 4, it's fine. Yeah, the Nami matchup's awful, I've already mentioned that, but it can't be understated. It's a terrible matchup. And like I said at the start, it's very fair, but there's no super favourable free matchups. There's nothing your opponent's going to flip over, and you're going to be like, yes, free win. We can go and get some food this round. It's a lot of 50-50s, going to rely on your skill, your opponent's skill, and of course the luck of the draw. So this is 40 cards, not 50. I would strongly recommend, if you're playing the control build of Shanks, I would consider starting from here and then adapting with whichever text you like. We're going to go over all of these cards one by one, but I think this offers a little something for every matchup, whilst not being too crazy in any direction. So, card by card, first up we've got Uta. She is your searcher. Searches most of your curve, your Yasop, your Ben, and your Tenkos Shanks, of course. Really important to see this into Teach, because against them you just want volume of attacks. Doesn't really matter how big your attack is, even just slapping 3 Don on Uta and going 5 at face is exceptional. It's also great for removing Bonclay. So in those matchups like Red-Purple Luffy, where they're very likely to pay out a Bonclay, seeing an Uta earlier gives you a little bit more breathing room to get an attack through on their face on that turn where they tap the Bonclay. Building Snake is a 1-2, it's a Gordon effect, it gives minus 3000 power. It just increases the reach of all your removal. Rayleigh and Ben hit a 9, which is some of these cards here, Moria, Dragon, and Yamato. Let's Nugate hit an 8, which is Luffy, Taro, Rayleigh, Katakuri, and notably the 5-cost Trash Luffy. This is a really important one in the BY matchup. Not specifically for Nugate, of course, but getting rid of that Trash Luffy is really important in that matchup. Also lets Marco hit 6, which is really nice. If you can sort of pre-jack the Building Snakes, play them out on 1 or 3, then play out the Marco on 5. You can hit anything that Doflamingo plays out. You can hit the Zorojuro, you can hit 5-cost Kid Blocker, which is really good. Gives you a lot more aggression in that early game. Aggressively removing your opponent's units is wonderful, especially into these matchups like Purple Luffy and Doffy. They're just going to try and aggro you down and not let you get to that late game where we are the strongest. One last note I did have on the Snake is if there's a unit you've just got to remove, don't be afraid to just use him and then attack into that unit. There's no shame in doing that. Sometimes there's just a body, you've got to get it off the board, and Building Snake is effectively like a plus 2k power buff, right, to your attack. Because it costs 1 but gives minus 3, and if you have multiple attacks, you get even more value than that. So the Building Snake I think is really good. Shame it doesn't have counter, but you know, what can you do? Otama is one of your classic 2Ks. I'm not so high on this one at the moment. I was on 4. I've sort of cut down a couple in favour of the 2-cost Sanji. But this is also another nice card you can combo with your removal cards. Hit 7 to 8k units like Luffy Taro, or 5k with Marco, but that does have to specifically be on the 6 Don turn, because you have to play her out, because it's an on-play. Whereas a Building Snake, you can pre-jack him, which is better. Otama Lime Juice, and also Building Snake Lime Juice by extension, is a really nice combo at the end of the game to hit just the most blockers in the game outside of Tenkos Teach. You just stop them from being able to block, which is really good for ensuring a victory. 2-cost Sanji, Enel, Nami, and Teach. You want to play this against those matchups. Enel's going to starve you, and Sanji counters that. Nami is just going to... You just lose that matchup, but if you see a couple Sanjis, maybe you can do something. Gives you that extra 7k attack every turn that you can protect him, which is pretty nice. And into Teach, this is actually really inefficient for them to remove. They've got to use 2 cards to do it because Dock Q only hits a 1. And if they're using like a 4-cost event to remove your Sanji, That's pretty good value for you. That's pretty good value. Also note it can wake up Roger. If you're at 1 life and you've got a Sanji on the board or a Roger on the board, you can either play the Sanji or activate the Sanji to wake up your Roger, turn on his effect so your opponent can't use their blockers. Hongo. So he's a 3/3 2k. You tap him and you give -2 to a dude. Very reminiscent of the Starter Deck 6 Tashigi. Much better than that though, because that's just cost. This being power means you can then attack into the unit. You don't have to just remove it with some of your removal cards. This is really important in the mirror. If you're going first, God forbid, you need to establish this or building Snake to hit their Shanks with your film Shanks. If you're going first, they get a Shanks and you can't clear it, the game is just incredibly over. The game's already very bad if you're going first to begin with, but if you can't clear their first Shanks, it's Jova. It's decent on 3 into Doffy, forces them to bounce it with Law, and if they bounce it with Law, that's kind of fine because they're not playing out a better unit than Law like Boa or Weevil, and you're getting a 2k back to your hand, which is never too sad. If they don't bounce it with Law, you can just tap it and free swing into whatever is tapped off their leader effect, or you get to KO a 5k unit with Marco, which is pretty good. And then they have to swing into the Hongo because they can't just leave this on the board, so it effectively acts as a 1k to block a swing. Hongo Lime Juice hits most blockers at the end of the game, but is expensive. In a pinch, you could do it, but it's not generally advised. Lime Juice is the best 2k to hold for the end of the game. What it does is, on play, you choose one of your opponent's 4,000 or less characters, and they can't activate blocker. Really good. Combo with your reducers. It's cracked. Just a small note that don't be afraid to use this in the mid or even late game when you're not going for game, but you must remove a character. For example, if there is a tapped Jack on the board and your opponent has a Rebecca blocker, you can Lime Juice their Rebecca blocker just to guarantee the KO on the Jack. Obviously, if you can remove the Jack with your removal cards, that's even better because it's not costing you a 2k and it's developing something meaningful. But if you can't do that, then using Lime Juice on the Rebecca and then just ramming a lot of Don into the Jack is very valid. Sometimes it's more important to remove something on your opponent's board than keep this 2k in your hand, even if it might win you a game later on, because winning the mid and the early game gives you an easier path into the late game. Bad manners. We play many bricks, so we're playing a 0 cost. I'd play at least 1. 2 is probably preferable, but 1 is honestly fine. It depends on how many bricks your build is playing. But I would definitely include at least 1. We're playing Rayleighs, we're playing Dragons, we're playing Shanks. Moving on. This is 10 cost Shanks. You know what this card does. This is just ridiculous. This is the main boss monster / payoff for our deck. Giving everything -1,000 power is not dissimilar from just making your leader a 6,000 power leader permanently. And the fact that you can stack these is just bananas. You get 2 of these down against like a Doflamingo deck. Their Jinbeis are 3k, and you've got leader effect. It's just nuts. It's really nuts card. It's great in pretty much every matchup. Finding this on curve, especially going second, is just wild. Really hard for your opponent to deal with. This is a 12k power unit. Even if your opponent has like a 9,000 power dragon that they played out previously, you're minusing that down to 8. Ramming 12 into 8. Even if they save it and pile all their Don in, it's only 18 into 12. You use your leader effect, that's 17. And then you've just got to give them like 3 2Ks, which is very reasonable if that's their only play for the turn. Make sure you don't let it get knocked out for no reason. Against Enel, try and bait out Ragos if you can. Sometimes you can't, sometimes they'll just have Katakuris for all your 8 costs, which is a shame. But getting one of these to stick into Enel is just crazy. It really is just crazy. And one thing to note is it can't be free blocked by 10 cost Teach, at least on the turn that it comes down, because of this effect giving the Teach -1,000 power. They would have to give you at least 2k, which they don't play a lot of 2ks in the Teach matchup. This is very important for that matchup too. Silver's Rayleigh is a 5/6 blocker on play if your opponent has 2 or more characters with 5,000 power originally. Draw 2, trash 1. So note this is original power. If you've got like a big Shanks on the board that minuses down a bunch of Doflamingos dudes to 4, This still fires, which is pretty good. Mostly just a backup plan. This doesn't fit into your curve very nicely at all. Unless you're playing against a Doflamingo player, this is very rarely live on 5. This is much more of a late game card when you just need a blocker. Reasonably hard for your opponent to remove, can't be bounced by full cost lore, which is notable. Can be denied by Otama Lime Juice, which is a bit of a shame in the mirror, but it is what it is. If you're playing counter events, this is even better, because you establish that blocker and have a reason to keep Don up. Whereas if you're playing out like the 10 cost Shanks, you don't have any Don for your counter events. If you're playing this Rayleigh, it's really nice defensively. I will say it feels kind of weird. I'm not the biggest fan of this card. Most people were playing it at 4 right at the beginning, but it's kind of swiftly dropped off to like a 2 of maybe. I'm not sure you even necessarily need this if you're playing a lot of copies of Lucky Roo, but you know, having a couple of this can be nice, and it has counter at the very least. Yasop is a 5/6 on play, one of your leaders gains 1000 power till the end of your opponent's next turn. He also has this crazy when attacking, Don X1, you give something minus 1000. This is really good. This when attacking is quite often overlooked by people. They think about the on play, but the when attacking is just as good, if not better, arguably. This is going to be your best card on 5 into most matchups. Into Doffy, this is really good. But into Pluffy, if you are on 5, I would probably play out Lucky Roo before Yasop, just to get that board trade and deny your opponent going too crazy with the aggro. But yeah, in something like Doffy, if you get first, which is obviously ideal, on 1 and 3 you do whatever you do, and on 5 you drop Yasop, gives you that bit of defense for their next turn, and their next turn is when they're going to start attacking multiple times with whatever characters they played out on 4, be it a Jinbei and a Weevil, Jinbei and a Boa, whatever else. Then, once they've got some tapped dudes, if they've got a tapped 6k unit, you stick 1 Don on Yasop, and he attacks 7 into 5 on that 6k unit, or 7 into 4 onto a 5k unit, which is just so efficient, really hard for your opponent to justify defending, and for very little cost, right? Very little cost. So he has great defensive value, and then offensive value on the next turn, which is really cool. Also, late game, you can just play out like a Rayleigh and a Yasop on 10 to give you some pretty nice defense, filter out your hand a bit, get a blocker, and also increase your leader's power. So if your opponent has a lot of smaller units, this is very efficient. If your opponent has fewer big hits, obviously the blocker is more important, but against something like a Doffy, this Yasop in the late game even can be really good, especially combined with the 10 cost Shanks. Then you're a 6k unit, and all their dudes are minus 1000. It's pretty crazy, pretty crazy. Beckman is exceptional. He is a 7/7 with 1k counter. On play, you trash a 6k. And note that's trash, that is not KO, which is really important against Black Yellow, Lucci and Smoker, to get rid of Sarbos and Borsalinos, and indeed units protected by Sarbos. It also gets around some nice on KO effects, like Lucky Roo, to deny those from going off. You can trash Marco with this, which is really cool. Your opponent doesn't get the choice to bring him back. And some other things here and there, just if your opponent has an effect based on KO, but not removal, Beckman's really good. You can combo him with reducers to increase the range, of course, and on curve, specifically on 7 especially, you use basically anything. There's not many 6 costs in the game, especially ones that he can't remove. The main things that you might not be able to remove with this on curve is a Luffy Taro. You can always combo it with the snake, or just remove the thing that the Luffy Taro played out, which is not quite as good, but still strong. Lucky Roo is a 4/5 1k blocker, and on KO, he KOs an character with an original power of 6000 or less. This hits tons of stuff, everything in Doflamingo outside of their 10 cost Kaidos. This hits Zoro Juro, Sangoro. This randomly kills blockers to let you go for game when you wouldn't have been able to otherwise. In Mirror, this is really nice because it can kill a Yasop, or I guess an opposing Lucky Roo, and start a chain, which is quite amusing. Really good into Purple Luffy. This is the best card in the matchup. It's really hard for them to interact with in that early game. They can rest it with 7 cost Sanji, but at least they're not playing Luffy Taro if that's the case. It's strong into Doflamingo, but if they bounce it with 4 cost lore, it feels really bad, because you've done nothing on your 4 on turn in that case. especially if you are forced to go second. It can feel pretty rough, but sometimes they don't have the lore, and if they don't, this is a really strong card. It's decent into Lucci, not ideal. Obviously, you're looking for your techs into Lucci, your Marco and your Ace, those bodies that can't be removed. But, you know, at least he trades with their removal card, be it full cost Lucci or a Brook, which is quite good. It helps you sort of maintain board neutrality rather than them going ahead on board presence, which is fine. Don't be afraid to swing with him. Even if he dies by battle, you still get this on KO. So just swinging with him if there's nothing particularly important you need to protect is very valid. This is one of the better techs, I'd say. It's really good into the Lucci matchup. Pretty good into the Smoker matchup too. Forces a double pop. Trash doesn't get around this, or KO. If there's any effect that would remove him from play, you can just deny and give him -2. Obviously, he doesn't gain Rush because we are not Whitebeard Pirates. But this card is still really good. Having counter as well is really nice. In those matchups where he's not good, like a Doflamingo, he's at least still 1k counter, which is pretty good. And he's also very sexy, look at that. Anyway, it's also really good to teach. Forces a 2-card combo with the Black Hole, because Finger Gun, they do Finger Gun, and you say, okay, -2000 power. So they've got to have like a Stronger and a Black Hole, or an already set up thing like a Van Augur or Laboon plus Black Hole. This is really good, especially on curve. If you're going first into teach, there's not really a better play on 5 than this. It forces them to already have Laboon and have Black Hole in hand, or use Stronger plus Black Hole, which is 2 cards, which is not good, obviously. It's decent in mirror. They can't remove it on curve. I generally prefer Yasop on curve in mirror, but if you're going first, you could play this out because it can't be removed even by Ben. Marco is probably the second best tech for your black matchups if you're struggling with things like Lucci. He comes back if you trash an event. It does have a cost, unlike the Ace, which is a little bit of a shame, but at least he doesn't lose the power, so he's harder to attack into after that. Just remember, you've got to have events. If you're not playing many events in your build, Marco's going to lose a little bit of his value. However, the removal in the early game, especially when comboed with Snake and Hongo, can be really good. But don't overlook that this just kills 2-cost Teach. In the Doflamingo matchup, 2-cost Teach is really annoying. They get that extra Don to play with, which lets them sort of almost play around our leader effect. So the Marco getting rid of the 2-cost Teach is really good, and then it's hard for them to deal with. They've got to play a Jozu to bounce this, and that doesn't feel very good. One thing to note is this is an on-KO. This is not the same as Ace. If your opponent plays something like Ben Beckman or the 5-cost Tashigi that will remove Marco, you do not get to save him. Red Hawk is mostly just good into Doflamingo. It can come up in some rogue matchups here and there, or to remove like a blocker, but generally this is just a Doflamingo tech. You're struggling with Doffy, you can try this. Your opponent is able to play around it. If they're just summoning a 6k unit, well, then you're just playing a counter card. And if they summon a Boa off the Jinbei, they can use the Boa to put a Don on the Jinbei, and then the Don's your turn effect will put the Jinbei out of the range of Red Hawk, which once people realise this, I think the stocks of Red Hawk fell off a little bit. Can be difficult for them to pull off this exact combo, but if they do have it, it feels really bad to be playing this card. One thing to note is the trigger is just a funny Bedge trigger. Minus 10,000 power basically denies their attack, unless they're doing something really crazy. Could also be nice on 10 with 8-cost Rayleigh, but I think this card is not the best at the moment. I think people are generally just playing around it. If you randomly leave 2 Don up with your Shanks deck, they're going to know what's happening. You're not going to fool anyone at this point. So I think Red Hawk's still decent if you're playing into Doflamingo players a lot, but I think there's better includes right now. One such better include for the Doflamingo matchup, I think, is this Nugate. He's a 7/8. On play, you give something arrested Don, and you can activate main, tap him, and get rid of a 5,000 power unit. Very reminiscent of 7-cost Jack, basically the same card, except Jack gets you a cycle and this one doesn't for some reason. Unsure on that. But either way, this is one of the best cards into the Doffy matchup. It's every 5k unit at base, and if you can combo it after a Yasop on curve, it's exceptional. Yasop can -1 whatever 6,000 unit they played, be it a Weevil, be it a Boa, and then Nugate just removes that, which is obviously a lot higher value than removing a Jinbei to hit a Boa or a Weevil, because the 6k stat line is just so good into Shanks. So being able to remove that with the Nugate and then remove something else next turn with him is just awesome. One thing I didn't put on the slide is it's a really nice combo with Rayleigh. You can use into the Doffy Matchup. If you can go Yasop into Nugate, remove one thing, maybe even remove another with the Yasop's attack. Then you play out Rayleigh, minus down one thing and remove it with the Rayleigh's effect, minus down something else, tap Nugate to remove that second body. It's just exceptional. This is also functional redundancy for Ben. If you don't find Ben, you can maybe find Nugate, and Nugate's nearly as good. Rayleigh is very expensive. Not in terms of cost, but in terms of money cost. This card's like $45, it's crazy. If you can't afford a lot of these, I'd say you want at least 2, but you could probably get away with 2. Run more dragons if you can't afford this card. I do appreciate it's very expensive at the minute. However, it is very important for the Doffy matchup. Effectively removes 2 bodies, it's a 6k itself, gives something else -2, and then both those debuffs lasting into your opponent's turn is really strong. And generally, it's good in most matchups. There's not many matchups other than like Teach, where you're depressed to see too many Rayleighs. And even into Purple Luffy, this is just so good. It removes their Sangoros and Zorojuros before Sangoro gets the chance to draw a card, and also makes it easier for your other units to swing into something big, like a Luffy Taro, or even a 9-cost Luffy. This can also buy you a turn. If you're just low on counter or you're in danger, you think you're going to die, this is effectively 5k counter, even if you don't remove anything, so don't overlook that. This is the 1-cost event. It's just top 5 for Red Hair Pirates. It's a shame the trigger doesn't activate main. I'm not really sure why it doesn't. They felt the need to nerf it a little bit for some reason. This is just extra consistency. If you want your list to be very straightforward, very consistent, you can run some of these. It's a shame it doesn't have counter, of course, being an event, but it is what it is. One other thing that is a little bit of a shame is it can't search Uta because she's just film. She's not a Red Hair Pirates, so you can't chain searches in that direction. Uta can search this though, so it is what it is. This helps smooth your curve out, especially if you're on second, since you'll often have a floating Don, and the same can be said of the Uta searcher. You'll notice a lot of our characters are odd Don costs. Yasop's are 5, Ben and Nugate are 7s. So in that early to mid game, having one of these to just get you a bit of search, dig you a little bit deeper into that deck to find that 10-cost Shanks, is very important. And I'll put here that it quote-unquote guarantees 10-cost Shanks. It obviously doesn't, but having some of these makes it much more likely that you will see that. And dropping that 10-cost Shanks on 10, there's very few plays as good as that. Dragon is an 8-9 rush on play, gives something 2-ested Don. Really good card. This has risen in stocks a lot since 07. When this first came out, red was kind of in the bin, not very good colour, but now red is strong once again, and Dragon's just reaping the benefits. Dragon is arguably the most important card, along with the other 10-cost rush units, into the Teach matchup. Really hard for your opponent to remove, forces either Finger Gun and Van Olga, or the Boon Black Hole. One of those cards is always unsearchable, so this basically just sticks on the board once it comes down, unless your opponent has a crazy powerful Jesus that can just remove it by battle. The fact that this always has rush, even if you don't have the on play, is just exceptional in that matchup. If your opponent in any matchup really is just having a weaker draw, they're not drawing too hot, playing out this on 8, just swinging 7 with leader, 9 with dragon, and then whatever with whatever characters you've got on the board, it's really nice pressure. It's going to get 1 to 2 lives and 1 to 2 cards, so there's no shame in just playing this out and going at face. If your opponent's having a weaker game, if they're either not dealing with your board or not developing much of their own that's meaningful, it's a great closer. It's the most efficient rush in the deck. Playing this out for 8 and then spreading the Don around is far better than just playing out another 10-cost Shanks, if you're specifically going for game. And it can be better than Rayleigh if your opponent's characters are all tapped. Into Doflamingo, for example, Rayleigh is very good, but if your opponent's characters are all tapped, Dragon is also very good. You're likely going to get rid of one character anyway, and have a reasonable chance of getting rid of that second character. So there's definitely something to be said there. Tenkos Film Shanks this is the most important card in the mirror, in my opinion, if you are forced to go first. If you can go second, I think the Tenkos Rush Shanks is more important. Just developing that on curve is really good. But developing this on curve, going second, is also really good. You get to remove whatever they did on 9, be it a Rayleigh or a Dragon, and develop that 10-12. Then if they play a Rush Shanks, you can just pile a load of Don on this dude and swing into it and likely get the removal, which is really good. If you're going first, you want to combo it with a pre-jacked Snake or Hongo to KO their Tenkost. This is a very standard combo in the mirror. If you're going first, this is basically the only way you win. And if they then answer yours, it is what it is. What can you do? It's also great into Enel. It removes Ace, it removes Yamato, it removes Katakuri, which is just great whilst developing your own massive dude. And their only way to deal with this is Raigo. And if this removes like an Ace, baits out a Raigo, loses them a resource that they trashed with the Raigo, it's exceptional. It has exceptional value, and it provides pseudo protection for your other Tenkos Shanks, because they've got one less Raigo, right? Pretty good. Also really good into Bonney. One of the, I don't want to say more scary cards, but one of the cards that can win them the game is the 9-cost Zoro. One funny thing to do is with the Rayleigh, you just put the debuff on the Zoro, then they attack in, and you put your leader debuff on the Zoro, and their Zoro is 5k base, which is just like crazy bad. But this can also just remove the Zoro for free, which is cool. It's great to stop Doffy chaining when they're using their Tenkos Doflamingos, which is really good. Mostly uses into Doflamingo, the blue Doflamingo leader. Too many Doflamingos. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty crap in that matchup. Maybe just trash it with a 0 cost. But I mean, maybe you can use it if they've not got many units. Who knows? Roger is generally good. He's not a card you want to play very many of, but 1 or 2 kind of changes the way you approach the game once you get it in your hand. Obviously, Pudding can send it to the Shadow Realm, but once you've got him in your hand, you can be way more aggressive at your opponent's life, because once you get them down to 0, you basically just win, which is really good. So a lot of the time you can sort of sacrifice your board presence to just go for life if it will result in them getting to 0. Don't be afraid to aggressively take your own life though. Sometimes if your opponent's just sort of got a lot of blockers and a lot of cards in hand, and they swing at you one too many times, you can go down to 0, play this out, and sometimes you just win. If you've got a nice board and they've just got a shitload of blockers, playing this just, it's a free win. Teach hates him. If you're playing into Teach and you get your Roger, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. Tenkos Teach just can't do anything into this. Yes, they can turn his effect off with another Tenkos Teach, but you're usually playing this out and winning the game on the same turn if you're approaching the matchup correctly. Just beware, because the best Blackbeard players will absolutely not hit you to 0 in fear of this. And 2-cost Sanji is his best friend. They leave you at 1, and you've got a Sanji on the board. You can just use your Sanji effect to get down to 0, and you even get the rested Don that you use to play out the Roger, which is really good. And also, if you've got him on the board and he's not negated by Teach, you can just play a Sanji to take that last life, if that would proc his effect and win you the game. Next up, a small note on counter events. I was pretty high on counter events. At the moment, I'm currently a little low on counter events. These are not particularly for any specific matchup. They are typically better in those aggro matchups though. Doflamingo and Purple Luffy, they can come up quite a lot, especially if you've got a floating Don here and there towards the end of the game. If you're not dropping Tenkos Shanks, leaving one up for a Rad Beam, even if it's just a bluffer Rad Beam, is quite valuable. Your opponent might think twice before going for game, lest they get Rad Beamed and stomped on the clapback. Guard Point is more of an early gameplay. Obviously, Rad Beam only gets that effect once you're at 2 life, which, as a Shanks deck, you're typically on sort of 4 to 3 life for a lot of the game. So if you plan on using these events to protect your characters, I'd probably opt for more guard points. if you're planning on using them to protect your life, I'd probably opt for more rad beams. I think generally rad beams better, but you know, your mileage may vary. Round Table is a very niche tech at the minute. It's really good in mirror. They play out their tank or Shanks, you use Round Table and then just remove it for free with pretty much any attack, which is great. It can also let your 5-cost Marco or a Nugate on the board remove anything in the game, which is really good. Unfortunately, it's unsearchable, right? It's Supernovas and Beautiful Pirates, so you can't get it with your Uta or your Searcher event. So I don't think this card is currently worth including, but if your locals is full of Shanks mirrors, maybe you could play 1 or 2. 3-cost units. So our freed on turn is basically, do we want to play a Hongo? If not, we're swinging either 8 or 5/5. So you could consider some of these. I've played them in the past. I was a big fan of the Zoro, even in a control build, just sort of diverts attention from your life in those couple early turns, which can be quite good, whilst getting a little bit of extra pressure into your opponent. Jiraiya is a nice blocker, but he's very easy to remove. He gets bounced by Law. He gets removed by like anything in red. He gets shut down at base by Lime Juice, unfortunately, which is a little bit of a shame. Baccarat is maybe a little bit more compelling because he just gives you turns your bricks into 2Ks. So even if you don't have the blocker effect if that gets shut off, you still have a free 2K, which is fine. But this doesn't attack. At least Jiraiya can attack. And into decks like Black Yellow Luffy that go big with their leader, Jiraiya is a really meaningful attacker. Also into Red Purple Luffy, this is pretty good. Becomes 6k. 3/6 attacker is no joke. But I think all of these have their use case. But generally, I'm not particularly high on any of them at the moment. So now we'll go on to some sample lists. This is the straightforward red hair build that Mangley was able to pilot to win the Treasure Cup just before Christmas. This build is very much focused around the Doflamingo matchup. Doflamingo is widely perceived to be the best deck in the format, but Mangley decided to forego the inconsistency of Red Hawk in favour of the Nugate. The Nugate really good into that Doflamingo matchup, especially if you couldn't play Yasop before it, and having these extra event searchers along with the full playset of Uta really increases your consistency on seeing that Yasop, and even Yasop into Ben Beckman is very strong in that Doflamingo matchup. So if your locals is full of Doflamingos, I would absolutely recommend a list like this. And if you enjoy like a more straightforward, streamlined playstyle, this is a very consistent version of the deck, and I can thoroughly recommend this list. If you want a bit more of a teched out version, this is around what I'd go for. You can see we've added 3 of the Ace for the Black matchup and 2 of the Marco for the same sort of matchups, but also for that bit of removal. We've got the Red Hawk, sort of just going with, even if your opponent swings 7 and then does the Jinbei Boa combo, so you can't kill the Jinbei, at least this gets you out of the 7 for a very low cost. The trigger sometimes just comes up and wins you a game, and if your opponent can't play around it, then you just do get some crazy value out of this into that Doflamingo matchup, or if you can combo it with the Rayleigh. The other main includes we've got an extra copy of the Bad Manners, because this can trash the Gum Gum Pistol Red Hawk if you're bricking up on them. Other than that, we've got most of the guys. We've still got 3 of the Lucky Roo for the Purple Luffy matchup. Still got 2 of the Building Snake. The consistency of this list is a little lower. We don't have the Nugate as redundancy for Ben Beckman, so you've got to kind of see him. And we only have 3 of the Uta Searcher with none of the event. So your consistency on finding your curve is going to be a little lower, but this does give you a better shot into matchups like Lucci. So if that's a matchup that you're particularly worried about, you could consider something like this. In terms of curve, your odd curve is fairly straightforward. You're playing the card with the number in the top left, that is the amount of Don you have. On 1, you're going to play out your searches if you have them. You can also choose to establish Building Snake. On 3, you'll sort of need to work out whether you want to use Hongo this game. That's obviously going to depend on what else is in your hand, what matchup you're going into. For example, the Hongo is pretty good into something like a Doflamingo matchup, where they're fairly likely to have a tapped character on 4. But into something like a Shanks, you might still want to establish this if you're going first in a mirror, but you could also forego this in favour of playing it a little later, when your opponent is not going to be able to remove it. If you play this on 3, and then they play like a Marco to remove it, you've lost a lot of value. So it's more of a debate in that matchup. In something like Lucci, you're obviously not playing this. If you're not playing Hongo, 5-5 with neuter is great. 5 Don, you've got the pick between whatever 5 cost you have in your hand. Find most of the time Yasop is very powerful. If you've managed to establish one of these, Marco can be great for a bit of spot removal, and Ace is important in those matchups where he is important, obviously mainly those black decks, but even into a red mirror, he is pretty good. 7 Don, Nugate is better if you have established Yasop, or unless your opponent has a character that can't be KO'd, like a Sabo, like a Borsalino, in which case Ben is better. If you're not playing Nugate, obviously you're just going to look to play Ben on this turn. There are turns where Ben might not be the right play. If your opponent hasn't established anything meaningful, you could go with the Yasop, of course. This is obviously all flexible, depends on how the game's going, but generally speaking, I'd say Nugate is your number 1 if you've got Yasop. If you don't have Yasop, Ben is your number 1. On 9 is when the game starts to get a bit more freeform. You've got a lot of different top end, and which is best for your situation is going to vary on how the board's looking, what matchups you're in. If you're against Teach, Dragon is obviously miles better than Rayleigh, but against Doflamingo, Rayleigh is usually much better than Dragon. So it's going to depend on your matchup, but you're looking to play out one of these big guys. And on 10, I really like to slam the Rush Shanks. If you can slam the Rush Shanks on 10 in pretty much any matchup, it's very good. Obviously, you've got to be sure that you're safe and you're not going to die. That's particularly into decks like Purple Luffy that can sometimes just kill you if you play this and don't remove anything. But in general, this is just such a strong play. It can't be overestimated. And the big KO Shanks, mostly you're going to play this in mirror, but there will be spots here and there where getting the removal on a body is more important than the defense that this provides. So you can consider this, of course, as well. And indeed, if neither of these are what you're looking for, if your opponent's only got stood up characters and there's something that you really need to get rid of, you can obviously go with Rayleigh, you can obviously go with Beckman. Once you get to these later turns, the game is much more freeform for Shanks. It's just these first few turns where you really like to see your strict curve, especially on odds. On evens, 2 Don, if you're playing Red Hawk and you have Red Hawk, you need to work out whether or not you want to leave 2 up. Even if you can't KO something with the Red Hawk, just getting out of like one of those early sort of random 8s that they throw at you when they have nothing to do on 3 is pretty valuable. I do think this card is pretty good just for that, even if you're not removing a body. Obviously, if you're into Doflamingo, you're playing this and you have it, you absolutely need to leave your 2 Don up. There's no point playing this and then deciding not to use it. You might as well just take it out of your list. If you're not playing Red Hawk though, developing Building Snakes and Utas is obviously good, and the same for the Searcher event. On 4, I really like Lucky Roo. Even in most matchups, I like to develop the Roo, even if it's not obviously getting immediate value. Into Doflamingo, you need to debate whether or not this is better than just slamming 9 into the tapped character, and I think often slamming the 9 is correct, because if you just remove their body, you've done sort of the same job as Roo anyway, so it's not a million miles away, and obviously this gets hard punished by full cost law. On 6, again, you've got exactly the same as on 5 with your odd curve, except you've just got a random Don floating. You can use it at this point to develop a Building Snake maybe, or to do a search, or if not, you're just going to put it on one of your dudes and swing a bit harder. 8 is when you've got a little bit of flexibility on the even curve on 8. You can do Building Snake with Beckman, or of course Nugate, to get a removal on a larger character, or you can just go with Rayleigh. If Rayleigh's obviously better into something like a Doflamingo, but sometimes into like a red mirror, or even a purple Luffy, depending on what they've played out. The Building Snake comboed with one of your 7 costs can be stronger. On evens on 10, I pretty much always like this. There is obviously going to be some games where you want the KO Shanks, but your Rush Shanks on evens on 10 is just incredible. Because they've only had 9 the previous turn, unless they're a purple deck, of course. So there's a good chance that this is just going to win you the game, slamming this on 10. Especially if you can follow it up with another one. So, matchups. I've got a slide for each of sort of what I think are going to be the most popular 10 decks. Not necessarily the strongest, and as you can see on the slide here, This is what I like to go in these matchups, and this is the win percentage according to the most recent sim data. I think it's broadly accurate. I don't think there's anything I would massively disagree with. So I've put this here since it's numbers based and not opinion based. Into Doffy, you absolutely want to go first if you can. Their curve going first is just crazy. They can play out Jinbei and a Blower or a Weevil on that 3-don turn. It just gets a little too crazy for you to deal with, especially as on 4, all you're doing is Slam 9 or Lucky Roo. So I do think going first is massively better. If you've got Red Hawk, this is the matchup where it's good. If you don't, Yasop into Nugate is what you're going to be looking for in your mulligans. If you see Nugate and one Searcher, I'd probably keep. The chance of you seeing Yasop by that 5-don turn is fairly high. You're going to get to draw a couple cards, maybe do a Search or two. So I think you can sort of reliably find the Yasop, the Nugate, and also the 8-cost Rayleigh are sort of the cards that I'm looking for in my mulligans. Rayleigh clearing 2 bodies effectively is just insane. This is probably the matchup where it feels the strongest, just because everything they play is 6k or lower, so you're getting guaranteed removal with that -3, and -2 also just makes it so much easier for your Yasop and your leader to swing into tapped characters, and even if they save them, they're really weak on the next turn, so it buys you 2 attacks basically, and removes 1 body guaranteed, 2 incredibly likely. 10-cost Shanks, if you can drop it safely, is just insane. If you can limit your opponent to sort of 1 to 2 bodies, and then drop this and maybe clear 1 of them, you're just in such a good spot. Any subsequent body that they develop is going to be incredibly weak, and it makes it really tricky for them to sort of even play the game. Once their 5ks are reduced to 4, you've obviously got your leader effect. If you can drop another one on the turn after, the game's over. So I think against Doflamingo, you just really need to see your curve. That Yasop into Nugate is crucial, and Rayleigh on the turn after that is incredibly important. Roo is good if he doesn't get decked by Law. It's risky playing him out, but sometimes it's the best you've got, right? If they don't have a tapped character for whatever reason, you're obviously not going to slam 9. So at that point, you would play out the Roo. I also don't mind starving them sometimes on the first swing. Just giving them 1 less card, because once we get to the late game, that's when we stabilise and start to win. The early game is when Doflamingo is the strongest, and we're at our weakest. Shanks obviously is a mirror, 50% win rate. Going second, of course, because we love to drop our 10 cost on 10. I think this is a very simple matchup. The player going second will usually just win. Obviously, the player going first can win, of course. It depends on your draws and how skilled you are versus your opponent. But going second is a massive advantage in this matchup in particular. 10 cost Shanks on curve is by far the most important thing. Even if they play a dragon on 8, it's really hard for them to defend a 12 into 8. That's like 2 2s and a leader effect, and then you get to apply your 5k from your leader to their leader as well, which is just really good. Going first, you need to have aggressive pressure, because they are going to develop that 10 cost Shanks, and you're going to have to either try and deal with it with a Hongo or Building Snake plus KO Shanks combo, or just have enough aggressive pressure that they can't come back. I think going first is very rough. Obviously, go second if you can, but developing that Hongo or Building Snake, preferably on the turn before they go to 10, so on your 9, I think is very important. Round Table is a good tech, but the card kind of sucks in a lot of other matchups. So, I mean, if you're expecting only mirrors, consider Round Table, but there's a lot of matchups where this card sucks, and you can't find it, so it's a little unreliable. Next up, we've got Lucci. 51% win rate is, again, around even. You'll notice with Shanks, most of these top decks are around just that 50% win rate. It's very fair. You're not doing anything super broken, but you're also not doing anything super weak. So, you know, it's one of them. It's the 50-50 deck of the format. You want to go first, and those 5 costs are incredibly important to see on curve. Whether it's Marco or Ace that you're playing, Ace is obviously better because it doesn't demand you trash an event, but Marco has a lot of value too. He can get rid of things like Rebecca blockers to just give you a bit more aggression in that early game, which is nice. It's going to depend which you're playing, which you draw. They're both unsearchable, but I would be mulliganing for one of these on curve, absolutely. Even if you go second, this is just very important. Early aggression and the sticky bodies is what's going to win you the game. Like I say, these guys, if they live a turn, that's when you start to sort of brighten up and think, okay, this is It's looking good. They can obviously double pop the ace to get rid of it, more so into things like Smoker, but they can play out a Brook in the early rounds, and then play out that 5 cost Tashigi, give -4, leader effect, give -1, pop it with Tashigi, you negate, and then Brook drive-bys it. So, you know, there's a little something to be said for that, but that is much harder for Lucci, because they've got to have that Brook, and they've got to have, like, an Ice Age, really, because Tempest Kick's not going to be live on their 6th on turn. So it's harder for Lucci, but something you do have to note, ace can be double popped. Sometimes if they just draw all their events and Morias, you just lose. That's just how Lucci works. They draw the nuts constantly. There's not a lot you can do. Don't feel too bad. Don't think you've just griefed if they drop like Ice Age Moria, Tempest Kick Moria, Ice Age Moria on you. It is what it is. Sometimes Lucci games go like that. Jack is pretty easy for us to deal with, which is very nice. You can reduce him either with a Snake, with a Rayleigh. Otama Rayleigh clears Jack, which is incredible, whilst also giving -2 something else. So if they play Jack, you need to get rid of it. Thankfully for us, that's quite easy. Hold your Lime Juices. This is a really important matchup for your Lime Juice 2k. He's generally the best 2k to hold anyway, but in this matchup in specific, he is great because they are going to spam Rebecca's in that late game. The biggest sign that you're going to win this matchup is if you can get something to stick early, and then you play a 10 cost. If the 10 cost sticks, the game's basically over. And they do kind of need Ice Age specifically, because Tempest Kick, Helmeppo leader effect only reduces the 10 to 7. Lucci only pops, reduces by 7. Lucci only pops a 2. They do need to see that Ice Age really, or they're going to be expending multiple Tempest Kicks to remove one character, which is pretty good value for you. Purple Luffy is a matchup that kind of just depends on who wins the dice roll. If Purple Luffy goes first, in basically any matchup for them, they just win. This deck is crazy good going first because they have that perfect curve of ramping to 4, then ramping to 7, to shit out a whole bunch of dudes whilst the opponent is on very low Don. If they go second, they're doing the same thing, but they're just doing it a turn later. So the opponent of the Purple Luffy player has a lot more chance to establish their own guys, or deal with removing some of the units that got played before they can swing. So definitely go first in this matchup, if at all possible. One of the biggest cards in this matchup is going to be Lucky Roo, especially if you have to go second. The only real way for them to deal with the Lucky Roo in the early game is going to be that 7 cost Sanji that rushes it. Usohachi can rest it, but it's very inefficient, and they also need to be on 8 Don, which they're not going to be that early in the game. And to be honest, even if they play the Sanji and rest your Roo will still get some value later in the game. They're constantly playing these sort of mid-power units, and even if it just trades with like a Sangoro or a Zorojuro that's attacked once or twice already, it's still good. You're still blocking a hit, getting rid of a dude for just 4 Don, it's great. And also, if they're playing the Sanji, they're not playing Luffy Taro. Luffy Taro is the scary card. If they whiff that on their 7 or 8 Don turn, you're in a really good spot. If you can pull off Snake into Marco on 1 to 3 and then 5, that's great. That gets rid of Zorojuro, gets rid of Kid Blocker, gets rid of Sangoro. If you can pull that off, it's better than Roo. If not, Roo is going to be your next best play. The KO Shank's actually really good. Dealing with the 9 cost Luffy in particular is quite challenging, because even if you play the 10 cost Rush Shanks and attack in 12 on 9, that's perfect math for Gum Gum Giant, which is not good. You don't want them to have that much value out of their Gum Gum Giant, and attacking 12 on 9 is just shouting, please use Gum Gum Giant. So I do think the KO Shanks is quite relevant if that 9 cost Luffy comes down. If it's just a Lin Lin, the KO Shanks can also get rid of that, but it's slightly less valuable than if it was a Luffy. Just that extra 1000 power is really demanding. The other thing to consider with them is if they have a Don up, make sure you're swinging 4k above. If you're swinging 2 or 3, they're going to get great value out of Gum Gum Giant. If you can swing 4 over, do. Obviously, you can't always do this, but then it will at least cost them 1 hand size in addition to burning through the Gum Gum Giant. So, you know, at least you're getting a little bit of value. That Gum Gum Giant is crazy. At the end of the day, if they get to go first and they draw a bunch of Gum Gum Giants, it's a really tough matchup. But, you know, we can only do the best that we can do, right? Sometimes they just go get first, get their perfect curve, see Giants, and it is what it is. But like I say, if you prioritize getting the Roo and this Snake into Marco combo if you can in the early game is usually what's going to win this matchup, as well as of course the dice roll. Teach, I like to go second into Teach so that they can't play their 10 cost Teach on curve. It does mean that we're not playing 5 cost Ace or 5 cost Marco on curve, but you know, it's better to deny them their Teach for one more turn, and we can even establish a 10 cost on that turn. Do be careful when you drop your 10 costs, because if you only have one, it's sometimes better to play out like just a Rayleigh as a body or a Dragon with Rush, and then hold the 10 cost Shanks for after they play their Teach, just so that your 10 cost Shanks doesn't get stun locked by Teach. If you have multiple of them, you don't need to be so careful, it's all good. Roger in hand early on basically is a free win in this matchup, because you can then choose to just kind of ignore board completely. Oh, excuse me. So the way you're going to approach this is going to be very dependent on what you've got in your hand and what your opponent's playing. A lot of the time, you're going to want to play board to remove things like Lafitte and remove things like Laboon. They're really valuable targets to remove. Doc Q and Van Olga are great to remove too, but do bear in mind it gives them a card, so it's not as important as removing the Lafitte and the Laboon, obviously depending on what you've got in your hand. 2 cost Sanji's great. If you can get this early, it's really awkward for them to deal with. Doc Q hits a 1, so they've got to reduce it with something else, and that's typically either a Van Olga later in the game or a Stronger. So if you can get them to burn a Stronger, as well as play out the Doc Q to remove your 2 cost Sanji, you're already winning. A lot of the time they will just choose to attack, wait for you to swing with it, and then attack into it. But getting that one attack is just worth it. It's absolutely worth it. Drop 1 cost characters when you can, whether it's Uta or Building Snake. Not the on play of Uta is great if you can get it, but it's not the be all and end all. Just having those characters on the board to be able to put 3 Don on them and swing 5 is really important. That's true of literally every deck into Teach. Teach is just a resource game. They will run out of cards, and you've just got to be able to capitalize on that before they get too crazy with the amount of 10 cost Teachers they've played. They're going to turn off your on plays from about 7. That's when you can do Ben Beckman, and he's sort of the first really impactful on play. Obviously, Marco's pretty good. It can remove things like Lafitte. It can remove Doc Q. But at the end of the day, that's costing them a card, and it makes very little difference. So they may as well keep the card in hand, unless they've got like a really bad one. But generally, they're going to just turn you off from 7 onwards. So it's something to be aware of. Generally, I do actually think Teach is a little more favourable than this. I think the better the Shanks player, the higher your win rate into Teach will be. Sometimes they'll just have the stuff for every single character you play, but some of their really important cards, like the Finger Gun and Laboon, are not searchable, which is very helpful for you. You just got to weigh up when to go for life, when to play board, and that's all just going to depend on what's in your hand. Next up, we've got Black Yellow Luffy. As with literally every deck, you want to go second into Black Yellow Luffy to deny their Moria for one more turn. The way I like to approach this matchup is literally just hard starve. I don't want to attack into them again at all until I've established sort of 2 to 3 massive characters, like 7 cost and above. If you start attacking into them crazy early, they're going to get value out of their Egghead Luffy. They're going to get value out of their leader effect, buffing their leader even more. So it makes it harder for you to defend their hits. If they get a lot of 2Ks in the early game, it can be a little rough, but you know, it is what it is. One of the most important things in this is to make sure you can establish either a Hongo or a Snake to let your Ben Beckman KO the Trash Luffy. That's the 5 cost 6k one that trashes a life. That is the most important card to clear. If you can clear that immediately, you're forcing them to have another one to lower their life. And that could put them in a pretty awkward position. If they go second, which is their optimal curve, they're going to want to play out the Trash Luffy on that 6th on turn. Then, as long as you've got the Hongo or the Snake pre-jacked on the board, you're going to be able to use that and then use either Newgate or Beckman, whichever is the option you have, to remove that Trash Luffy. And like I say, removing that Trash Luffy is just so important. If it sticks around for multiple turns, you're in a real pickle. You are in a real pickle because their life is going to get low, their hand is going to get big, and that's when it starts getting scary. I don't like swinging until I've got at least one 10-cost character on the board. It's all just going to depend on what's going on, though. It's really a matchup where you've got to pay close attention, to what they're doing and what you've got in your hand. Roger is great. If you draw Roger, 100% play into it. Try and get them to 0. You can get them to 0 and not, because they're going to want to stay at 1 life, right, as they typically do. So if you can force them to 0, you're going to have a turn where Roger wins the game, and it's just finding that at that point. The other reason I like to leave them high on life is Rhaego is the new card that is really strong in this matchup. They remove your 10 costs for just 6, which is really good. If you can leave them on sort of 4, 3, or even 2 lives, at least Rhaego's costing them something. Not only is it costing them the card, but it's costing them a card from their life, which, I mean, it's not the craziest. Sometimes this can actually help them, but, you know, it's like Teach, it's a resource game. So the more cards you can get out of their hand or out of their life, going directly to trash, the better. Red Purple Luffy is one of our worst matchups by far. They're a 6k leader, which means our leader effect doesn't get a ton of value, which is unfortunate. They're also kind of just doing a lot of the same things we are, but a turn earlier. The 3 life might seem rough, but we're not like a heavy aggro deck, so it doesn't really matter. They're going to get to that late game. They have access to Gum Gum Giant, we don't, and they're going to get to drop their 10 cost, whether it's a 9 cost Newgate, a 10 cost Shanks, a 9 cost Luffy, whatever the big character is, they're going to get to drop that. Probably a turn, maybe even 2, before we can drop one of our 10 cost Shanks, which is very challenging to deal with. If you can, go first and do Snake or Hongo into Marco to KO the 3 cost Zorojiro if they play that on 4. That's excellent. Marco's also really good at dealing with Bonclay, if that's their ramp of choice on 4. But it's just one of them where it's a pretty tough matchup. They do have a significant advantage into us. You've got to remove what you can and just try and survive. Once you're sort of both playing 10s, that's when it evens out a bit. Your 10 cost Shanks, both the KO and the Rush, do get pretty good value into them. But it's just tough. They're doing what we're doing a turn earlier. And if they draw all the Gum Gum Giants in the world, well, I mean, good luck. Enel is one of our better matchups. I don't think it's that crazy. I think it's more of like a 55 than a 57, although I suppose that's not much of a difference. Turn order's not that important, but I do like second, because we play 8s and 10s. Just lets us get them out a little bit earlier, and their 7 on turn in particular is quite weak. They don't tend to have a lot to do. One card that is quite good is 2 cost Sanji. If you can establish this alongside an 8 cost like Dragon or Rayleigh, that's really strong, because they then can't remove the 8 cost and the Sanji. So at that point, the Sanji is probably sticking for the game until you need it, save for some crazy triggers. As with any deck into an L, you've got to be patient, leave them at 2 life until you're confident you can make a meaningful push into their life. Swinging 5 with your leader sometimes, if you have the board presence to be threatening to them, to demand at least sort of 2, 3, 4 cards out of their hand, if they choose to take that 5, is good, because then they're likely to counter. If you can get a card out of an L's hand, that's brilliant. The more single cards you can get out of them, the better. If they turn any characters sideways, attack them by all means. However, otherwise, if their characters are all upright, just leave yours upright. There's no need to turn your characters sideways. They're just going to pile into them. It's going to cost you cards, it's going to cost you resources, and that's when it gets tricky. Lime Juice is a good hold for the 2 cost Shirahoshi blocker. Beckman can trash it, but it doesn't feel very good to be doing that. I mean, it's better than nothing, but, you know, the Lime Juice is really strong at the end of the game for that Shirahoshi blocker in particular. Also, if they're playing any random trigger blockers like Brûlé, the Lime Juice will hit those too. KO Shanks is one of the most important cards, in my opinion. They play out an ace heal. You can just kill the ace and establish a 10-12. They've got to have Rhaego. If they play the ace and heal to 3, just KO the Shanks, don't attack them, leave them at 3. Because then, if they want to play Rhaego to remove your massive 10-12, they're going to lose 2 lives. They have Flampeys, they have Flampeys. You can't play around everything, but demanding that they either have that or Raigo and lose 2 resources is very valuable. If you expect a lot of Enel at your locals, firstly, my apologies, but I would include maybe 2, or even you could go to 3 of the KO Shanks. I'd probably stick at 2, 3's a little crazy, but card is very good in the matchup. Trying to bait out Raigos with 8 cost characters is something I've put here. It is easier said than done, I will absolutely give you that. The 8 costs are typically going to get katakuri'd, you are going to be starved. So, and then once they've sort of got enough cards in your life, they're going to start playing Yamato and popping your 8s with that, which is not ideal. But don't underestimate the power of dropping like 2 or 3 sort of lower cost units, maybe a 4, maybe a 5 here and there. Dropping multiple units can sometimes be better. It forces them to either have Godatsu or play the Nami, and then the Nami trashes a card from their hand, and they won't get the draw because their hand's going to be massive. So that's quite valuable. If they see all 4 Raigo, you probably lose, but a good amount of the time they don't, and demanding they see it early can sometimes be the way forwards. They are going to mulligan for it, it's the best card in the matchup. But, you know, it is what it is, just be patient, and you shouldn't lose to triggers really ever into Enel with Shanks. We're not like Doflamingo, where the triggers just kill all of our dudes. A Bedge trigger is not the end of the world. So long as you're not greedy, the triggers aren't going to be what loses you the game. It's going to be them seeing enough sort of Raigos and then top ends. Nami is by far our worst matchup. You basically can't win. I don't really have any good advice for this matchup, as you can see. It's a 25% win rate. Go second if you can, because our curve is better going second into Nami. But yeah, it really doesn't matter. Rush is obviously good, but we're just too slow. We're just too slow to deal with this deck. Use the extra time that you're going to have after you get decked in 5 minutes. Go grab some food, get a drink, have a chat, maybe do some trades. Bonney is the last deck I want to talk about. I like to go first in this matchup, which might be a little contentious, but the reason I like to go first is so that I have that 7-Don turn, and that 7-Don turn is Beckman, or I guess Newgate, and you're going to remove their 5 cost. The Cavendish and the Carrot's not so great into us, but the Cavendish is obviously just a crazy card. If you can play Beckman on 7 to remove that on what was their 6-Don turn, that's really good. And also on 5, you can establish something like a Yasop, or even a Rayleigh blocker, even though it's not going to get the effect. Just getting a dude down is always nice. And the fact that it is a blocker is quite good. We do have a pretty good win rate into them, and I think that's mostly because a lot of their deck is kind of worthless. The 9-cost Zoro and the 8-cost Kid just don't do anything. If you hold a Rayleigh in your hand, they play 9-cost Zoro, you can either KO it with the KO Shanks, of course, or you can just put the Rayleigh debuff on it. Yes, it's not going to remove it, but a 9-cost Zoro that has 6,000 power is not threatening. And then when they attack in, you just put your leader effect on it. Now it's 5,000 power. It's just so weak. Even once you start getting the Rush Shanks on the board, this card's just garbage. I think a lot of people are somewhat scared of the 9-cost Zoro in a matchup. And I mean, if you don't have the stuff to deal with it, it can be threatening. But if you've got that Rayleigh, or just even multiple Shanks on the board, it's just not that good. Kid also is just irrelevant. All of our cards are massive. So they've probably got like 5 or 6 cards in their deck that are just complete garbage. On top of the Carrots not being that effective into us. Because yes, you can stun Beckman and Yasop, but a lot of our stuff is just 8 cost and higher. So the Carrot doesn't get as much value as it would into something like a Doflamingo or a purple Luffy deck. The 9-cost Shanks is by far the best card for them, in my opinion. It just deals with one of our 10-cost rushers and establishes an 11k body, and 11k is just outside the range of our KO Shanks, of course. So be wary turning your 10-cost sideways. If you think they've got a KO Shanks, maybe think twice about turning your dude sideways. But, I mean, it's hard to play around forever. But I would say that keeping your guy upright is sometimes just a better play. Forcing them to do something like worse, like play out a 9-cost Zoro. And if your stuff's upright, 10-cost Doffy is also like garbage. So it is what it is. And the Doffy chain can sometimes get you. That is probably what will get you. If you do lose this matchup, it's going to be some kind of Doffy chain. Or you make a misplay around the 9-cost Shanks. KO Shanks is great for breaking out of Doffy chain. Yes, they can play another one. but you've still got this 12k body, and the Rush Shanks is obviously very good into that as well, but just removing that first Doflamingo is very important, and the KO Shanks is by far the easiest way to do that. But I really don't think you should be having too much trouble with this matchup. They can obviously get you. This is not like a 75 matchup like the Nami one was, but I do think we are pretty favoured into the Bonney. So, that was a long video, right? Thank you for watching very much. Thank you for listening to me yap. That was my complete guide to OP09 Shanks. This was the winner of the poll, was to make some more detailed guides on decks. So I hope you enjoyed my insights. If you've got any more tips, make sure to leave them in the comments for our fellow Shanks mains, or even for me to learn something. I'm always looking to learn more. I do not claim that I am a top tier player. I'm just trying to learn, have a bit of fun, and impart the knowledge that I've gained so far. If you disagree with anything I've said, let me know why. I'm always happy to hear opposing opinions. Like I say, I am not God. I'm wrong a lot, so please let me know. But I probably plan on making 1 or 2 of these per set. This is not going to be like an every week thing. I'm only going to make these for decks that I'm really comfortable with, of course. I want these to have at least some value to all levels of players. Of course, this is going to be great for beginners, but I want there to be something in there for the intermediate and even some of the higher skilled players too. If you're winning regionals, you're not going to get much from a video like this, but I think that goes without saying. Either way, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.